Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 18 stories for you, including the herd of the High Lantern, the grip of the static giant, the patient of the unspoken word, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The herd of the High Lantern. Come closer, little one, and let the fire warm your toes. You want to know how your great-grandfather survived that lonely island? You want the ending to be different, where the lighthouse stayed bright and the fog stayed at bay. Very well, let us travel back to that salt-cracked stone tower. He lived in a place where the land was nothing but a jagged tooth of rock poking out of a restless, churning sea. Every day was a cycle of light and shadow, and for the first year, the silence was his only companion. But as the winter months stretched out, the silence began to feel crowded. He started to notice the dampness. At first, it was just a single smear on the exterior glass of the lantern room, a moist, palm-shaped smudge that hadn't been there when he went to sleep. Then came two, then a dozen. They weren't just marks, they were deliberate. Every morning, he would wake to find the glass weeping with fresh, wet prints. They weren't human. They were small, oval shapes, perfectly moist, as if a miniature hand had pressed against the pane to feel the warmth of the lamp. He began to hear it too, a soft, rhythmic sound like wet velvet dragging over stone. It was the sound of the herd moving just outside the glass. He couldn't see them clearly at first, for they were small, hoofed shapes, huddled together in the spray. They didn't have bodies of their own in the traditional sense. They were a collective, a tumbling cluster of velvet-furred shapes with tiny, cloven hooves that clicked against the rock. But the most unsettling thing about them was their singular, shared vision. They didn't have individual eyes. Instead, a single, massive, luminous eye moved across the herd like a wandering moon. It was a golden sphere of liquid light, pulsing with a slow, deliberate heartbeat. It didn't belong to one creature. It moved from the front of the cluster to the back, opening and closing as it scanned the interior. One night, the fog grew thick enough to swallow the horizon. Great-grandfather sat in his chair, the oil lamp flickering, and he watched the herd press against the glass. They were no longer content to stay in the shadows. The single eye began to blink rapidly, growing larger and more vibrant. It was searching for him. He realized then that they weren't just looking at the light, they were tasting his presence. He could feel the moisture from their bodies seeping through the glass, a cold humidity that made the air smell of deep-sea kelp and old rain. One evening, the clicking of their hooves grew frantic. The herd began to move in a perfect circle around the lantern room, their small bodies bumping against each other with a muffled thud. The single eye was wide now, a shimmering orb of amber that seemed to occupy the very center of the herd. It wasn't just watching him, it was judging the solitude of the tower. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pressed his palm against the glass, right where the eye was focused. For a moment, the herd went still. The clicking stopped. The single eye dilated until it filled the entire cluster, reflecting his own startled face back at him. It was so close that he could see the tiny veins of gold pulsing within the sphere. Then, with a collective shudder, the herd leaned in. The glass didn't shatter, but it groaned under the pressure. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure, as if something were trying to push through the barrier between the outside world and his own. The single eye blinked one final time, and then, the herd let out a low, vibrating hum that resonated in his very bones. They weren't just visitors anymore. They were waiting for the glass to give way. In the morning, the fog had cleared, and the lighthouse was perfectly still. There were no more damp prints on the outside of the glass. Instead, there were 3 small, wet marks on the inside, right at his eye level. He realized then that the herd hadn't just been watching him from the outside. They had finally found a way to step into his world, and they were still standing right behind his shoulder, waiting for him to turn around. The grip of the static giant. The town of Oakhaven doesn't exist on most maps anymore, a smudge of dust in the middle of a dying desert where the heat feels heavy enough to bruise. I pulled my sedan into the lone gas station just as the sun began to collapse into a bruised purple horizon. It was a simple place, one pump, a rusted canopy, and a small shack that smelled of burnt oil and old paper. I didn't expect much, but the silence of the desert has a way of amplifying the smallest sounds. When I stepped out of the car, the air didn't just sit on my skin. It seemed to press against me, expectant. I walked toward the pump, my boots crunching on the gravel, and that was when I felt the first prickle of electricity. It wasn't a spark, but a subtle, humming tension in the atmosphere, as if the air itself were holding its breath. I reached out to touch the cold metal of the pump handle, and my hand didn't just land. It was seized. For a fraction of a second, my fingers felt heavy, as if they were being pulled downward by an invisible weight. I looked around, but the desert was empty. There was no wind, no bird, no person. I took a breath and adjusted my grip, but the sensation returned, a faint, vibrating hum that made the hair on my forearms stand straight up. Then, the pressure changed. It wasn't just a weight, it was a shape. The hair on my left arm suddenly jerked upward, forced into a distinct, jagged pattern. It wasn't a random mess of fuzz, it was a perfect, wide print of a palm. The hair stood up in a cluster of peaks, mirroring the pads of a thumb and the curve of a hand. It felt as though a massive, invisible hand had pressed against my skin from above, pressing its palm against my bicep. I froze. The desert went unnervingly still. I could feel the static charge intensifying, a frantic buzzing that made my skin tingle. It was as if a giant were leaning over me, its palm resting on my shoulder, waiting for me to notice it. I moved my right hand to touch the metal again, and the hair there reacted too, but differently. It didn't just stand up, it began to ripple like water, moving in a slow, rhythmic wave toward my wrist. It felt like a pulse. I realized then that the static wasn't just a byproduct of the air. It was the physical manifestation of a presence. I looked up, squinting against the fading light. There was nothing there, no towering giant, no looming shadow, just the vast, empty sky. Yet, the sensation of being held was undeniable. It was the certainty of a grip. I felt the hair on my arm flatten slightly, as if the invisible hand were tightening its hold, squeezing my muscle with a firm, steady pressure. I tried to pull my arm away, but it felt as though I were trying to yank my limb out of a thick jar of honey. The more I resisted, the more the static hummed, vibrating deep inside my chest cavity. It was a steady, grounding weight. I realized that the hand wasn't just touching me, it was anchoring me. I was a small object held by something much larger, something that didn't need a body to be felt. I stood there for a long time, a lone human figure in a dying town, held steady by a massive, unseen palm. Then, the pressure suddenly vanished. The hair on my arm collapsed flat against my skin in an instant. The hum died. The desert fell into a true, hollow silence. I took a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs, and felt a sudden, sharp chill. I looked down at my hand, still trembling from the intensity of the contact. The print of the palm remained in my hair for 3 seconds before the strands settled. I realized then that while the entity was gone, the grip hadn't been a fleeting ghost. It was a permanent fact of the landscape. The hand was still there, just out of my line of sight, waiting for the next thing to be held. I climbed back into my car, my muscles aching from the phantom squeeze, and started the engine. As I pulled away from the pump, I felt one last tiny jolt of electricity travel from my shoulder to my fingertips. It was the sensation of a thumb lightly brushing against my wrist, as if the giant were giving me a small, parting nudge. The Patient of the Unspoken Word. Subject: Elias Thorne. Status: discharged conditional. Location: Ward 9, the Upper Reach. To the attending physicians, Elias Thorne is no longer required to remain in the physical confines of Ward 9, though his transition to the domestic sphere must be handled with extreme caution. For 3 months, Elias occupied the condemned upper floor, a place where the floorboards have forgotten the weight of footsteps and the dust settles in thick, velvet layers. It was here that he encountered the autocomplete. It began as a minor cognitive glitch. Elias would sit in the corner of room 402, staring at the peeling wallpaper, and a word would simply finish itself in the air. He would think of the word door, and the air would vibrate with the completion, handle. He would think cold, and the room would echo, mist. At first, he found it whimsical, a psychic typewriter providing the punctuation to his internal monologue. Then, The autocomplete began to anticipate thoughts he hadn't fully formed yet. He would start a thought, the chair is, and before he could decide on an adjective, the room would supply, hostile. It was during this second month that the entity arrived to inhabit the gaps. It was not a physical body in the traditional sense, but a presence that manifested as a shimmering distortion in the air, resembling a veil of woven silk that shifted colors from deep copper to bruised plum. It had no face, only a series of concentric ripples that pulsed like a heartbeat. It didn't walk, it flowed toward Elias, dragging its hem of silk across the floorboards. The entity began to speak, but it only spoke when Elias paused. Every time he stopped thinking, the entity would offer a completion. I am. Elias would think. Hungry, the entity would whisper. But the entity had a peculiar quirk. It spoke Elias's name with every wrong syllable stressed. It didn't just say his name, it interrogated it. It would say Elias, then Elias, then Elias, each time shifting the weight of the sound until the name felt like a different object entirely. By the third month, the autocomplete became aggressive. Elias tried to hold a thought, to keep a thought private, but the entity would steal it. He would think the light is soft, but the entity would cut him off and complete it with, suffocating. He began to fear his own mind. If he thought of home, the entity would finish with abandoned. If he thought of sleep, it would finish with shallow. One night, the silence became unbearable. Elias sat perfectly still, trying to achieve a state of pure, blank thought. He wanted to be a vessel of nothingness. He squeezed his eyes shut and pushed every memory, every sensation, and every noun into the back of his mind. He wanted to think of nothing at all. But the entity lived in the nothing. It surged forward, its silk veil vibrating so fast it hummed like a cello string. It hovered inches from his face, the ripples on its surface glowing a dull, angry amber. I am. Elias thought, his mind a desperate vacuum. Waiting, the entity finished, its voice vibrating in his teeth. Elias gasped. The completion was correct, but it felt heavy. He tried to think of a simple verb. I see. The end, the entity completed. It was no longer just completing his thoughts, it was predicting his inevitable conclusion. He realized then that the entity wasn't just a companion, it was a scavenger. It was eating the potential of his consciousness. It was taking every what if and turning it into a what is. He tried to fight back. He forced a thought of joy. Temporary, the entity countered. He forced a thought of love, heavy, it whispered. Elias stood up, his heart hammering. He decided to speak aloud to reclaim his agency. He wanted to say, I am the master of my own mind. He opened his mouth to say, I am, but the entity beat him to it. Yours, it finished. The word didn't just hang in the air, it settled into his bones. The silk veil expanded, wrapping around his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He realized that by allowing the entity to finish his sentences, he had surrendered the power of the beginning. He was no longer the author. He was merely the first letter of a very long, very certain sentence. He took a deep breath to say, I am tired. Forever, the entity whispered, its ripples pulsing in a rhythmic, steady thrum. Elias closed his eyes, but he could still see the copper-colored silk dancing in his peripheral vision. He realized that even when he stopped thinking, the entity was still there, waiting for the next blank space. He is now permitted to leave the ward, but he must be warned. Do not think too much about the silence, for the entity is already preparing the next word. The exhale of the wardrobe. Subject 402, B. The field observation. The train didn't just stop, it surrendered to the grass. When the gear ceased, the cabin fell into a vacuum of silence so absolute it felt heavy, as if the atmosphere were pressing against my eardrums with physical weight. Outside, the meadow was a monochromatic expanse of swaying stalks, bathed in the bruised purple of a dying twilight. Inside, I sat on the velvet bench, my own breath becoming a rhythmic metronome. Then, the house, or rather, the portable cabin began to settle. It was the moment the internal hum of the engine died, and the external roar of the wind subsided into a tentative whisper. That was when the closet began to exhale. It started as a vibration in the floorboards, a low-frequency thrum that felt like a purr. From the darkness of the wooden wardrobe, a long, shuddering breath escaped. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of air being forced through velvet lungs, a moist, rhythmic huff that carried the scent of ozone and old linen. I looked toward the door of the closet, which stood slightly ajar. The darkness inside wasn't empty. It was dense, like a pool of ink waiting to spill. "Is someone there?" I whispered, the words feeling fragile in the vast silence. No answer came, but the exhale deepened. It was no longer just air, it was a physical movement of the shadows. I noticed the temperature in the cabin begin to plummet. The warmth of my own body seemed to be sucked toward the closet like a magnet. As the cabin grew colder, the closet began to glow. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. It was a cluster of luminous, amber-colored nodules, each one the size of a grape, pulsing with a soft, inner fire. These nodules were clustered on a body that looked like woven copper wire, shimmering with a metallic sheen. It didn't have a head to tilt. Instead, it had a crown of these glowing spheres that shifted and rotated independently. It was a creature of pure charge. It began to emerge. It didn't walk so much as it flowed out of the wardrobe, a tangled mess of glowing wires and pulsing amber light. It moved with a stuttering grace, each movement accompanied by a sharp click-whir sound. It was hungry. It wasn't eating my food or my space, it was drinking my heat. As it drew closer, the amber nodules began to flare. The dimmer the room became, the brighter the creature burned. It was a living lantern, but its light was hungry. It reached out with a limb that looked like a braided fuse, and as it touched my shoulder, the warmth vanished instantly. I felt a jolt of electricity race down my spine, a tiny spark that made my hair stand on end. "Please, don't take it all," I murmured, my teeth beginning to chatter as the cabin's remaining warmth was drained away. The entity responded with a violent exhale. A cloud of pale, glowing mist erupted from its core, swirling around my head. It was feeding on the kinetic energy of my heartbeat. I could see the amber nodules turning from a soft gold to a fierce, blinding white. The more it ate, the more it expanded, its copper wires stretching until they nearly touched the ceiling of the cabin. I sat perfectly still, trying to minimize my movement to save my heat. The creature hovered inches from my face, its crown of spheres spinning like a carousel of miniature suns. It was beautiful, but its beauty was predatory. It didn't want to crush me. It simply wanted to turn me into a frozen statue of energy. Finally, the creature reached my chest. It pulsed once, a massive, radiant thrum that felt like a deep sigh of satisfaction. The amber light turned a steady, serene blue. It stayed there for a moment, anchored to my ribs, vibrating with the leftover warmth of my soul. Then it retracted. It slid back into the closet, its wires folding like a collapsing umbrella. The glow faded, the amber nodules dimming until they were mere flickers of coal in the dark. The cabin returned to its equilibrium, the silence returning, but it was a different kind of silence now, a heavy, satisfied quiet. I sat, in the dark, shivering in the sudden chill, listening to the wardrobe. It didn't just sit there. I could hear it settling into its nest, the faint click-whir of its copper wires adjusting. It had finished its meal, but it hadn't left. It was waiting for the next time the world went still, for the next time it could draw the heat from the living and turn the silence into a feast. And as the final ember of my own warmth flickered out, I realized the train hadn't just stopped. It had surrendered to the grass, and I was the offering left behind in the center of the cabin. The grocery list of the lost. To the next person taking over the watch, don't let the silence trick you into thinking the canyon is empty. It is never empty. It is simply waiting. My shift ended at 3 a.m., just as the first tremor of the flash flood siren began to moan through the sandstone walls. I was sitting on the floor of the slot canyon, the narrow passage pressing in on me from both sides, when the water started its low, rhythmic pulse. It wasn't a roar yet, just a distant hum of impending weight. That was when the thing emerged from the shadow of a jagged overhang. It didn't walk so much as it unfolded itself. It was a towering, textured mass of crinkled paper, a creature woven from thousands of discarded grocery receipts. Its body was a tapestry of faded ink and thermal paper, smelling faintly of old coffee and supermarket aisles. It had no face in the traditional sense, but a cluster of receipts hung where a head should be, shimmering with the frantic scribbles of human intent. It moved with a dry, papery rustle, its many limbs shifting like a deck of cards being shuffled by an invisible hand. It didn't have eyes, but it had a way of pressing its receipt chest against your heart, vibrating with the items it had collected. As the siren grew louder, the canyon floor began to vibrate. The thing approached me, its paper skin crinkling in the rising wind. Then I heard the twins. They were standing just a few feet away, two identical boys who had been exploring the canyon before the rain started. They were perfectly still, their faces pale in the amber light. They weren't speaking, but the thing was reacting to them, its paper body fluttering as if it were trying to decide which one to claim. The sound of the approaching water was a steady thrum now, a heavy pulse that made the sandstone walls sweat. The creature extended a limb made of a particularly long receipt from a bakery, its tip twitching. It hovered between the two boys, its body glowing with a soft, yellowish light. It felt as though it were weighing their existence, measuring the sum of their lives against the items they would need in the afterlife. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. The thing moved closer, its paper body brushing against the boy's shoulders. It began to hum a low, vibrating sound like 1,000 pens scratching on parchment at once. It was reading them. It was calculating the final tally. I watched as the creature's body rippled, the text on its skin shifting from whole milk and apples to deep regret and the last breath. The boys remained motionless, but their eyes were wide, reflecting the shifting text. Then the thing paused. It reached out with a receipt that listed a warm loaf of bread and touched the forehead of the first twin. Then it reached out with a receipt that listed the scent of rain and touched the forehead of the second. The water was closer now, a wall of liquid approaching from the bend, but the thing didn't care. It was focused on the choice. It was deciding which of the boys would be consumed by the flood and which would be preserved in its paper memory. I felt my own breath hitch in my throat as the creature's body began to vibrate violently. The receipts began to fly off its body like tiny, fluttering moths, swirling in the rising wind. I saw the way the creature's chest expanded, showing a final, massive receipt that spanned its entire torso. It was the master list. It was the summary of the end. The twins stood as still as statues, their hair whipping around their faces. I realized then that the creature wasn't just observing them. It was choosing the one whose life was more complete. The water surged forward, a wall of brown and gold, but the thing stayed perfectly still, anchored to the floor. It leaned toward the first twin, its paper body shivering. Then it leaned toward the second. The choice was happening in the heartbeat between the sirens. The boys looked at each other, then up at the paper giant. The thing finally settled. It pressed its center against the second twin, and a soft, satisfying snap echoed through the canyon, the sound of a receipt being folded for the final time. The first twin vanished, not into the water, but into the paper, his body dissolving into a flurry of white scraps that settled on the ground. The second twin remained, standing tall as the water finally rushed over them both. I stood up, my own receipt falling from the creature's side. It listed one heavy heart, and the silence of the canyon. I took the creature's hand, a strip of paper that felt like old vellum, and felt it pulse. It was ready for the next person. I am leaving my shift now, but I will be watching from the ridge. I can see the creature moving toward the next set of twins, its body already beginning to write the next list. The thing is never hungry for food. It is only hungry for the day you stop. The Modem of the Deep Earth. To the survivor who finds this manual, let it be known that the mining camp at Sector 7 is no longer a place of physical extraction, but a vessel for a singular, patient consciousness. You are holding the user guide for the Great Negotiator. You are instructed to read these words while the sun is still high, for once the last ray of light retreats behind the jagged peaks, the camp belongs to the signal. The crew left 3 days ago, leaving behind the smell of wet iron and the silence of hollow stone. They believed they were leaving a graveyard of machines, but they were actually leaving a dinner table where the guest had only just begun to arrive. At first, the camp was silent. The lanterns were extinguished, and the heavy timber frames of the cabins sat like rib cages against the dirt. But as the clock struck midnight, the first vibration began. It was not a sound at first, but a pressure in the inner ear, a subtle tugging of the atmosphere. Then came the first negotiation. The entity does not walk, it pulses. It is a shifting mass of iridescent, oily membrane, resembling a wet, translucent jellyfish that has been stretched across the surface of a sphere. It has no face in the traditional sense, but rather a series of undulating ridges that ripple like water. It lacks limbs, instead possessing dozens of waving, ribbon-like cilia that trail behind it like the tail of a comet. It speaks in the dialect of the old world's data. It does not use words of flesh. It communicates in the piercing, rhythmic shriek of a dial-up handshake, a series of melodic chirps, static bursts, and grinding metallic hums. It is trying to establish a connection with your consciousness. It wants to sync your heartbeat to its own frequency. On the second night, the negotiator moved from the center of the camp to the perimeter. It hovered near the main forge, its oily skin shimmering with colors that don't exist in the daylight, a deep, bruised violet that bleeds into a metallic copper. It let out a sharp, high-pitched trill, a burst of data that made the dust on the floor dance in geometric patterns. It was searching for a port. It was looking for a way in. By the third night, the sensation became intimate. You found yourself sitting in the center of the camp, the air thick with the scent of ozone. The negotiator approached you. It did not move with grace. It moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, its cilia brushing against the ground with a sound like wet silk sliding over glass. It hovered 3 feet above your head. You felt the air grow heavy, as if you were underwater. Then, the shriek began. It was a frantic, jagged sequence of noises, a low moan of electricity, a rapid-fire clicking, and finally, a long, sustained whistle that vibrated in your very teeth. It was offering you a trade. It wanted to map your memories into its membrane. Each chirp was a question, will you let me in? Each burst of static was a bargain. It reached out with its leading cilia, the ribbon-thin tip touching your forehead. The contact felt like a tiny spark of frost. You realized then that it wasn't just listening, it was uploading. Your memories of childhood began to flicker like a dying bulb, while the negotiator grew brighter, its oily skin turning a vibrant, pulsing amber. In the final hour of the 4th night, the negotiator achieved a perfect sync. The noise ceased. The shrieks smoothed out into a single, harmonious hum that resonated in your chest. The entity expanded, its membrane stretching until it nearly touched the walls of the camp. It wrapped its cilia around your shoulders, pulling you into its iridescent fold. You could feel its thoughts, not as words, but as data packets of pure sensation. It gave you the feeling of falling, the taste of salt, and the sensation of being crushed by a mountain, all at once. It had finished the negotiation. You were no longer a spectator. You were a component of its network. The connection was complete. The negotiator settled into the dirt, its amber glow dimming as it began to digest the architecture of your soul. You sat perfectly still, a human port in a vast, alien machine. As the first light of dawn touched the camp, the entity folded inward, becoming a small, hard bead of copper light on the floor. It had finished its work for the night, but it remained there, waiting for the next time you closed your eyes to let it begin the next upload. You realized then that while you were still breathing, you were no longer entirely yours. You were merely a folder in its vast, unfolding memory. The negotiator didn't just want to see you. It wanted to keep the pieces of you it had gathered, stored away like secrets in a well-organized archive. You looked down at the copper bead and realized that every time you blinked, a small piece of yourself was still being sorted into its internal shelves. It is safe to sleep now, provided you don't mind that you are no longer the only thing dreaming. The Glossary of the Still Town. I arrived in Oakhaven on a Tuesday, though in this town, Tuesday is simply what the locals call the day of heavy light. There is no traffic here. The asphalt roads stretch out like veins of cooled wax, perfectly smooth and devoid of the hum of engines. It is a town where time doesn't march forward so much as it pools like rainwater. I found myself at the only diner still open, a sagging structure of timber and tin nestled at the town center. The sign outside offered the only nourishment for miles. Inside, the air smelled of scorched sugar and old velvet. I sat at a booth, watching the way the dust motes danced in the dim glow of the overhead bulbs. There were no other patrons, only the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet. I ordered a cup of tea, and as I drank, I realized the locals didn't speak much. They communicated in a vocabulary of survival, using their own words to describe the world I had only just begun to perceive. To them, sun was actually the eye that blinks, and wind was the sigh of the unseen. When I asked the waitress what the tall grass outside was called, she whispered that it was the teeth of the meadow. I spent the night at the local inn, a small building with a single room that felt as if it were breathing. As I lay in bed, the silence was not empty. It was heavy, like a thick blanket of wool. I fell into a shallow sleep, only to be jolted awake by a wet, rhythmic thudding. It was the sound of something heavy moving across the floorboards. I opened my eyes and saw them, footprints. They weren't the messy prints of a human foot. They were perfectly oval, deep depressions in the wood, arranged in a straight line starting from the heavy oak door and leading directly to the edge of my mattress. Each print was filled with a strange, glistening moisture. The closer the prints got to my bed, the more they changed. Near the door, they were faint, mere indentations. By the middle of the room, they were deep and swollen, as if something had pressed down with significant weight. By the time they reached my pillow, they were almost overflowing with a thick, viscous nectar. Then I noticed the smell. It wasn't the rot of a dead forest, but something sweeter, a ripe, sugary rot. It smelled of overripe peaches left to ferment in a jar of honey, mixed with the musk of damp earth. The rot was growing. As I watched, a new set of prints began to form, appearing one by one as if an invisible weight were walking toward me. I sat frozen, my breath hitching in my chest. I could hear the rot thickening. It wasn't just a scent anymore. It was a physical presence. It began to seep from the prints, a syrup of gold and amber that bubbled slightly at the edges. I realized the footprints weren't just marks of where something had been. They were the trail of what was currently approaching. The sugary rot began to climb my legs, coating my skin in a sticky, delicious film. It felt warm, pulsing with a faint vibration like a heartbeat. The closer the rot got to my chest, the more intense it became. It tasted of caramelized nectar on my lips. I felt a weight settle onto the foot of the bed, a pressure that wasn't quite a body, but was definitely a presence. It was the sugary rot, the entity that lived in the gaps between the seconds. It was the thing the locals called the sweetness that swallows. It didn't have a face or a shape, but as it moved over my torso, I felt its texture, smooth like polished fruit, yet grainy like sugar crystals. It moved with a deliberate, slow grace. I reached out a hand, and the rot coiled around my wrist like a warm ribbon. It was pulling me toward the center of the bed, drawing me into its delicious, decomposing heart. I realized then that the footprints weren't a path for a traveler, but a destination for the end. The rot reached my face, coating my cheeks in a shimmering glaze of amber. I could feel it beginning to crystallize, turning my skin into a hard, sugary shell. The sensation was exquisite, a delicious ache that made me want to close my eyes and let the sweetness take me completely. I felt the final push of the rot reaching my forehead, the scent of 1,000 ripe fruits blooming in my nostrils. I closed my eyes and felt the texture of the rot settle over my eyelids like a final, sticky veil. The weight on the bed shifted, pressing down until I was almost submerged in the nectar. It was perfectly still, perfectly sweet, and perfectly heavy. I realized that the town wasn't empty. It was just waiting for the rot to finish its meal. As the last of the moisture settled, I felt a tiny, sharp prick at the back of my neck, a single, crystalline grain of sugar hardening into a permanent part of my skin. I realized then that the rot wasn't just visiting me. It was claiming me to become the next thing the locals would call the one who remembers. The Second Set of Porcelain. The nursery was a transition space, a room caught between the past and the present. One half of the ceiling was a pristine, eggshell white, while the other remained a faded, peeling sage green from a century ago. It was a room of contradictions, where the scent of old dust fought against the sharp, clean aroma of lemon wax. I had moved in alone, seeking the solitude of the old house, but the nursery felt like it was waiting for an occupant who had already moved out. I spent my first week establishing a routine, settling into the heavy oak chair by the window and listening to the house breathe. The only thing that felt truly strange was the small wooden table in the center of the room. Every morning, I would set out a single porcelain teacup and a small saucer. I would drink my tea, then leave them on the table to dry. They were my anchor in the vast, silent house. However, on the fourth night, I woke at 3 a.m. to a sound that wasn't the usual groan of the floorboards. It was a rhythmic, wet click, like a bead of water hitting a stone, repeated 3 times. When I sat up, the room was bathed in moonlight. I looked at the table. The teacup was gone. In its place stood a second cup, one I hadn't placed there. It was identical in shape, but possessed a glaze of deep, bruised violet. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I had hallucinated it in my sleep. The next morning, the violet cup was still there, and I found myself staring at it with a growing sense of unease. By the third night, the miracle repeated. I set out my white cup. When I opened my eyes, there were 2. Then 3. Each time, the new cups appeared with a different hue, amber, charcoal, and a pale, sickly yellow. They weren't just appearing, they were being placed with deliberate care, arranged in a perfect semicircle as if being presented to a guest. I began to stay awake, watching the table with narrowed eyes. One Tuesday, the moon was full and the room was silent. I watched the white cup sit in the center of the table. Then, from the shadows of the corner, something moved. It wasn't a ghost, at least not a traditional one. It was a limb. A massive, jointed arm emerged from the darkness behind the table. It didn't just reach, it unfolded. It was a strange, architectural limb. Every time it moved forward an inch, a new elbow joint sprouted from the skin, blooming like a flower in slow motion. These weren't just simple hinges. They were textured with iridescent scales and tiny, vibrating hairs. The arm was the color of wet slate, and instead of a hand, it ended in a broad, flat surface that looked like a smooth river stone. It reached out with a series of click, click, click. The arm extended, adding a new, knobby elbow with every fraction of an inch until it finally touched the table. It didn't grab the cup. It seemed to press it down, smoothing the porcelain as if satisfying its own hunger for order. I sat frozen, my breath hitching in my throat. The arm didn't have a body to speak of, just a heavy, swinging shoulder that hovered in the air like a floating buoy. I watched it work through the night, adding more cups, more colors, each one perfectly spaced. By dawn, the table was crowded with a dozen different vessels. I realized then that the entity wasn't just placing them, it was cataloging them. It was an architect of the mundane. I reached out to touch the nearest cup, my fingers trembling. As my skin met the porcelain, the arm suddenly lurched. It didn't retract. It extended another inch, and a fresh elbow burst forth with a wet, organic pop, bringing its stone-like tip closer to my face. I realized it wasn't just reaching for the cups anymore. It was reaching for me. I leaned back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The arm paused, the new joint quivering with a life of its own. Then, from the shadow where the shoulder hovered, a voice soft as a sigh drifted into the room. "Is this one correct?" it asked. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like the friction of 2 stones rubbing together. I managed to whisper back, "It is perfect." The arm retracted slightly, the multiple elbows folding back like a collapsing telescope. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, safe in the belief that the entity was satisfied. When I woke the next morning, the nursery was bathed in the golden light of sunrise. The table was empty. The white cup, the violet cup, the amber cup, and all the others were gone. I sat up, my heart skipping a beat as I looked at the table. There was only 1 cup left. It was a deep, bruised violet, and it was perfectly centered. Then I looked down at my own hand. My fingers were no longer my own. They had been replaced by a broad, flat surface of smooth river stone, and my wrist was now a series of 3, perfectly aligned, iridescent elbows. I reached for the cup, and as I did, I felt a new joint sprout from my thumb, clicking into place with a sound that echoed in the silent room. The entity hadn't just visited, it had started the process of replacing me. The Tenant of Room 404. October 12th. I arrived at the Grand Meridian at dusk. It is a strange, geometric marvel of a hotel. The corridor on the 4th floor is perfectly linear, stretching into a vanishing point that seems to swallow the light. Every single door is identical, heavy oak, trimmed in brass, with a circular knob that feels slightly too cold to the touch. I am staying in room 404, though the numbers on the doors are barely visible. They are there, but they seem to change when I am not looking directly at them. For now, it is peaceful. The carpet is a deep velvet blue, muffling my footsteps. October 14th. I heard it last night. A sound from the hallway. It wasn't a footfall or a hum. It was the sound of something dragging a heavy piece of fabric across the floor. When I opened my door to investigate, the hallway was empty. Or so I thought. The doors were all closed, uniform and silent. But as I stood there, I noticed the door directly across from mine was slightly ajar. A sliver of shadow peered out. I felt a presence, a heavy weight in the air that smelled faintly of old parchment and wet stone. October 16th. The symmetry is starting to grate on my nerves. I spent an hour walking the length of the corridor. Every door is the same. Every door leads to a room that feels exactly like my own. I started to notice a peculiar phenomenon. Whenever I turn my back on a door, it seems to groan. When I turn back, it is just as it was. But tonight, when I looked at the door of room 408, I saw a hand. It wasn't a human hand. It was a hand with too many knuckles, each one bulging slightly, skin stretched thin like a drumhead. It gripped the edge of the wood. Then it retreated. October 18th. I saw it today. It emerged from room 412. It doesn't walk so much as it flows. It is a creature of strange proportions, wearing the face of a human woman like a poorly tailored mask. The skin of the face is a bit too large, hanging slightly over the cheekbones, and the corners of the mouth are perpetually pulled into a half-smile that doesn't reach the eyes. It has a cluster of small, pearl-like bumps along its jawline. It moved toward me, its body a smooth, seamless torso of iridescent scales. It didn't have a head so much as a face pod perched on a thick, muscular neck. It stopped 3 paces away. October 20th. It is following me. Every time I enter the corridor, it is there. It doesn't move when I look at it, but it moves when I blink. It has started to mimic me. It sits outside my door now, waiting. I can hear its breath, a rhythmic, wet clicking sound. It is trying to learn the architecture of the hallway. It is trying to learn the weight of my presence. October 22th. The mask is shifting. The creature is no longer content with just wearing the woman's face. It is beginning to reshape it. The eyes of the mask are migrating, sliding toward the temples. The mouth is widening, the teeth becoming sharper and more numerous. It spoke to me today. It didn't use a voice, but a vibration in the air. Is it heavy? It pulsed. I replied, the face? Yes, it is heavy. It responded with a series of rapid clicks, its body undulating like a ribbon in water. October 24th. I haven't left my room for 3 hours. The hallway is no longer empty. The creature has occupied every door. It sits behind each identical wood panel, watching. When I step out, it is a gauntlet of faces. It is no longer just the woman's face. It is trying to wear my face too. I saw it press its own head against my chest this morning. It didn't have a nose of its own, so it pressed its forehead against my chin, trying to find the right spot. October 25th. It is getting closer. The creature is now standing directly in front of my door. It is no longer just wearing the woman's face. It is beginning to split the mask down the middle. The skin is cracking like dry clay. Underneath the skin, I can see the true muscle of the entity, pale, corded fibers that twitch with every heartbeat. It reached out and touched my cheek with a hand that had 3 thumbs. It whispered, almost. Ready. October 26th. It happened. It took the mask off. It didn't just peel it back, it threw it away. The woman's face fell to the floor like a discarded glove. The entity revealed its true self, a pulsing, geometric shape of shimmering glass and soft velvet. It had no fixed features, only a constant state of becoming. But then, it reached into the air and pulled out a new face. It was my face. My eyes, my mouth, my brow. It settled it onto its own body. October 27th. I am sitting in the middle of the corridor. The creature is standing before me. It is wearing my face perfectly now, every wrinkle and curve captured in its own anatomy. It reached out and took the woman's face from the floor. It looked at me, and for a moment, I saw my own expression looking back at me from its body. It leaned in close, the glass of its true form humming against my skin. It spoke one final word in my own voice, "Thank you." Then it took my face and walked into room 404, closing the door behind it. The inventory of the unwanted. Log entry, midnight. Descent initiated. The pressure gauges on the main console are steady, yet the peripheral sensors are already whispering. We are descending into the substorage, a subterranean expanse of organized silence. My task is simple: catalog the items left behind by those who no longer have room for them. The lights are dim, humming with a low electrical pulse. Log entry, 045. The pressure gauges are beginning to fluctuate. The depth is shallow, but the weight of the atmosphere is increasing. I am moving through aisle 4. It is filled with discarded memories. I find a rusted birdcage, a stack of moth-eaten quilts, and a box of porcelain cups. These are things people owned, then forgot. But as I move, I feel a strange sensation in my chest, a pang of hunger for an object I have never once desired. It is a heavy, iron key with a jagged teeth pattern. I didn't know it existed until I touched it, and now I want to possess it more than my own breath. Log entry, 112. The pressure gauges are drifting apart. The primary dial reads 40 psi, while the secondary dial screams at 85 psi. The air is thickening, smelling of old paper and ozone. I am in aisle 9 now. The silence is no longer empty. It feels occupied. I see it standing near the back of the unit. It is the Curator. It stands at the height of a grown man, but its proportions are those of a toddler drawn by a trembling hand. Its torso is a wide, rectangular block. Its limbs are slightly too short, ending in rounded, mitten-like hands. Its face is a smooth oval with a mouth that is just a horizontal slit of permanent surprise. It doesn't move, yet it feels as though it is watching the very way I breathe. Log entry, 140. The gauges are warring. The pressure is erratic, pulsing like a heartbeat. I found a velvet chair and a set of silver spoons, but they are secondary to the new craving. I want a cracked ceramic bowl that holds a single dried seed. I have never seen it before, yet my hands ache to hold it. The Curator has moved. It is closer now, standing at the end of aisle 12. It doesn't walk. It seems to slide across the concrete floor, its heavy torso swaying slightly. It has a peculiar way of existing. It occupies space without taking up much of it. Log entry, 215. Pressure is mounting. The hum of the facility has turned into a rhythmic thrum. The Curator is now in the middle of the aisle. It is reaching out with its mitten-like hands. It isn't reaching for the things I already own or the things I have always wanted. It is reaching for the things I have never thought of before. I find myself reaching for a wooden whistle with a missing tongue. It is beautiful to me now, though it was invisible to me seconds ago. The Curator seems to be feeding on my never-wants. Log entry, 245. The gauges are spinning wildly. The depth is irrelevant. The pressure is internal. Every time I look at a new object, the Curator inches forward. I want a rusted gear. I want a frayed piece of ribbon. I want a smooth river stone. The more I want these new things, the more the Curator grows. Its torso expands, its horizontal mouth widening. It is pulling the unwanted desires out of my mind like a vacuum. I feel my old preferences fading. The things I loved yesterday are becoming background noise, while the things I never knew I needed become screaming priorities. Log entry, 320. Pressure is critical. The lights are flickering, casting long, distorted shadows. The Curator is right in front of me. It is no longer a silhouette. It is a presence of heavy, rounded geometry. It opens its slit-like mouth, and a sound comes out, not a voice, but the sound of 1,000 objects being simultaneously named. I find myself craving a heavy brass compass with a broken needle. I have never wanted a compass until this exact heartbeat. The Curator leans forward, its crooked proportions straining against the weight of the atmosphere. Log entry, for a clock. The gauges have stopped moving. They are perfectly synchronized, pointing at a number that shouldn't exist. The silence is absolute. The curator is touching my chest. Its mitten-like hand is cold, feeling like damp clay. It isn't just taking my desires, it is replacing them. I no longer want the things I used to love. I have forgotten the joy of the books I read or the warmth of the coat I wore. I only want the things the curator gives me. A shard of sea glass, a bent nail, a scrap of lace. Log entry, 4:30. The final descent. The pressure is immense, pressing against my ribs. The curator is now looming over me, its wide torso nearly touching the ceiling of the storage unit. Its horizontal mouth has widened into a perfect circle. It is preparing to take the final never want. I see it, a tiny, translucent bead of light. I have never wanted it, but now it is the only thing in the world that matters. Log entry, 5 o'clock. The curator opens its mouth and pulls the bead in. The pressure stabilizes. The lights go out. I am left in the dark, holding nothing, yet feeling the weight of everything I never knew I needed. The curator is satisfied, and I am empty. Log entry, 5:15. The lights return, but the curator is gone. There is only a single object left in the center of the aisle, a small, heavy box. I didn't know I wanted it until I opened it, and now I realize the curator is still inside, waiting for me to want something else. The curator of the Crayon. Log entry, day 24, post all clear. The surface is silent, but down here, the air still tastes of recycled dust and old copper. I am the sole survivor of Sector 7, or at least, the one who is still breathing. The heavy blast doors have been sealed for a month, and the hum of the air filtration room has become my only constant companion. It is a cavernous space filled with massive spinning fans and humming ducts, where the atmosphere is scrubbed clean by the mechanical lungs of the bunker. It should be a place of solitude, yet I find myself never truly alone. It started on night 3. I found a piece of chalk on the floor and drew a simple stick figure on the reinforced concrete wall near the primary intake valve. It was just a man, standing stiffly. When I woke the next morning, there was a second figure next to him, a small, squat shape with a circle for a head. It hadn't been there when I closed my eyes. By night 5, a third figure appeared, taller than the others, with a jagged line for a limb. Each night, the drawing grew. It wasn't just that new figures were appearing, it was that they were changing. They weren't just static marks. They seemed to be migrating across the wall, leaning toward each other as if they were whispering in the silence of the bunker. I began to feel a strange weight in the room, a density in the air that wasn't just pressure. It felt like something was watching the chalk marks. On night 12, the figures began to change their posture. The man was no longer standing stiffly. He was now bent forward, his arms reaching toward the small, squat shape. I found myself sitting in my chair, clutching my flashlight, staring at the wall until my eyes ached. I realized that the drawings were no longer just marks on stone. They were becoming more detailed. The squat shape now had a textured coat of fur-like strokes, and the man had a wide, crescent mouth. I started to hear then a low, rhythmic vibration that didn't come from the fans. It was a thrumming, a deep vibration in my chest. It sounded like a feline's purr, but heavier, like the engine of a ship underwater. It was the sound of something moving in the shadows of the filtration room, just out of my direct line of sight. Every time I blinked, the figures changed again. The man was now kneeling. The squat shape was leaning into his side. And on night 18, a new figure appeared, a massive, hulking shape with a crown of jagged points. It was the largest yet, and it sat at the top of the group like a king. That was the night I first saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest and the air felt coldest, a shape began to solidify. It wasn't a ghost or a simple shadow. It was a crouched creature, about the size of a large hound, but with the body of a lizard. Its skin was the color of bruised plums, textured with small, shimmering scales that caught the dim light of the overhead bulbs. It didn't have a tail. Instead, it had 4 powerful limbs tipped with broad, flat pads. It had no nose, only a wide, pulsating slit where a mouth should be, and 2 large, golden-yellow nictitating membranes that flickered over its eyes. It didn't move like a mammal. It moved with a strange, fluid twitching, its body rippling as if it were made of heavy silk. It stayed in the corner for 2 days, watching the drawings. It seemed to be studying the chalk marks with an intense, hungry focus. Each time it moved, the purring intensified, a resonant thrum-thrum-thrum that made the dust on the floor dance in tiny patterns. It was getting closer. On night 20, the creature moved 3 feet forward. On night 22, it moved another 4. It didn't walk. It flowed across the concrete, its heavy pads making a soft thwip sound. The drawings were reacting, too. The figures were now huddled together, as if seeking shelter from the creature's presence. The man was now holding the squat shape in his arms, and the king-shaped figure was looming over them both. I found myself speaking to it, my voice cracking from weeks of disuse. "Are you the one who draws them?" I whispered into the gloom. The creature didn't answer with words. It simply pulsed. Its plum-colored skin rippled, and the purr became so loud it vibrated the very bones of my skull. It was no longer content in the corner. It moved to the center of the room, its heavy body casting a long, wobbling shadow. It looked at the wall, then at me, and then back at the wall. It reached out with one of its broad pads and touched the chalk drawing of the man. As it touched the stone, the man's arm actually moved, lengthening by an inch to meet the creature's touch. The creature let out a long, trilling purr that sounded like a sob. It was hungry for the marks. It was hungry for the growth. On night 24, I woke up to find the creature sitting directly in front of my cot. It was no longer lurking. It was waiting. It leaned forward, its pulsating mouth opening slightly to reveal a row of flat, square teeth. It looked at the drawing on the wall, then it looked at me. It reached out a heavy limb and touched the chalk man one last time, and the man's head bowed down. Then, the creature turned its golden eyes toward my own face. It didn't pounce. It didn't growl. It simply sat there, its body vibrating with a constant, contented hum. It had finally added itself to the wall. And now it was waiting for me to become the next mark. The Collective of the Depot. Please, let me try to get this right. My memory is, well, it's a bit like that old bus depot we're talking about, mostly empty, but with things tucked into the corners. Let me start again. It was the town of Oak Haven. Or rather, the town the interstate skipped. You know the feeling when you're driving and the highway decides to leap over a valley, leaving a small cluster of buildings behind to breathe in the silence. That's where the depot was. It was a graveyard of rusted metal, smelling of wet asphalt and old grease. I stayed there for a week, just to see if the silence had a weight to it. On the 3rd night, I found the monitor. It was a heavy, brass-cased device sitting on a workbench in the center of the main terminal. No wires, no battery, just a dial and a glowing amber bulb. I didn't know why I turned it on, but when the static cleared, a voice began to speak. It wasn't a hum or a whistle. It was a human voice, but it sounded like it was being projected from a throat that was slightly too wide for its chest. "Is it heavy?" the voice asked. I froze. There was no one in the terminal but me. I looked at the monitor, then at the shadows. "Who is there?" I whispered. The voice replied instantly, "We are here. We are thinking about your weight." That was the first time I felt it, that strange, plural sensation. The voice was singular, but the way it pulsed suggested a crowd. I spent the next hour watching the amber bulb. Every time the voice spoke, the bulb would flicker in a rhythmic pattern, almost like a heartbeat. By midnight, the voice became more descriptive. It wasn't just speaking, it was narrating my every movement, as if it were watching a play. "You shifted your weight to the left," it said. I hadn't moved yet. "Then you were about to blink." I blinked. The voice chuckled, a sound like a handful of marbles rolling over velvet. "We are hungry for the shapes you make." I began to notice the physical manifestation of the voice. In the rafters above, the shadows started to move. It wasn't one ghost. It was a swarm. They were tiny things, each about the size of a walnut. They had translucent, jelly-like bodies that shimmered with a pearlescent sheen, like wet soap bubbles. Instead of faces, they had clusters of vibrating cilia that acted as sensors, and they moved in a synchronized ripple. They were the swarm. But they insisted, through the monitor, that they were a single person. "We are one," the voice would insist whenever I tried to count them. "We are the weaver of the rafters." I could see them now, hundreds of these jelly beings tumbling down from the ceiling like slow-motion rain. They didn't walk, they pulsed. They moved in a collective wave, each one tilting slightly toward the other, creating a unified motion that made them look like a single, undulating organism. They were navigating the terminal, seeking the source of the sound. They didn't have eyes, yet they seemed to see my fear. They gathered around my chair, their jelly bodies clinking softly against the wood. "You're the center," the voice said, now sounding closer, right beside my ear. "We are the orbit." One of them, or perhaps all of them at once, leaped into my lap. It felt cool and slightly tacky, like a damp grape. The monitor flared bright orange. "We are touching you now," the voice whispered. The swarm began to expand, moving from my lap to my shoulders, then up my spine. They didn't just sit on me, they began to merge. They fused their jelly bodies, creating a smooth, translucent skin that covered my torso. I could feel them vibrating against my ribs, 1,000 tiny pulses becoming one steady thrum. They were trying to become me, to inhabit my frame. They were a person made of 1,000 small parts, finally finding a body to hold them. I sat there in the center of the depot, the monitor still glowing, the voice finally falling silent as the swarm reached my face. They didn't cover my mouth, but they gathered around my eyes, their cilia brushing against my eyelids. The voice returned. One last time, no longer coming from the monitor, but from the center of my own chest. "We are home." I reached out to touch one of them, but as my hand met the jelly, the swarm suddenly pulled inward, contracting into a tight, perfect sphere the size of a melon. It sat in my palm, humming with a low, satisfied frequency. The depot was silent again, the smell of grease and wet asphalt returning to fill the void. I stood up to leave, but the sphere didn't let go. It pulsed against my skin, a steady, rhythmic pressure. I realized then that they weren't just visiting my body, they were claiming it. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt a slight tugging sensation behind my ribs, as if something were trying to pull my skin from the inside out. I looked down at my hand and realized that the sphere had stopped humming. It was waiting. It wasn't just a swarm anymore, it was a resident. I walked back to my car, and as I turned the key, I felt a tiny, wet movement inside my chest, a small cilia cluster twitching against my heart. The monitor on the workbench behind me flickered one last time, casting a faint light on the empty floor. I realized that when I walked away, the swarm hadn't stayed in my hand, it had moved into my marrow, and it was beginning to rearrange my bones to fit its own geometry. Every time I took a step, I could hear it, a faint, internal clicking sound of 1,000 tiny things shifting into place, preparing to speak again when I was finally alone. The rhythmic pulse of the pines. I find it hard to explain how the silence of the countryside can feel heavy, like a thick woolen blanket pressing against your ears. When I boarded the Midnight Express, I expected the rhythmic clatter of the wheels to be my only companion. Instead, the forest outside felt intentional. It wasn't just a collection of trees, it felt like a single, massive organism. Every time the train surged forward, the pines didn't just sway, they seemed to lean inward, as if listening to the metal carriage slice through their bodies. I sat in my berth, the small lantern casting an amber glow over my knees, watching the silhouettes of the trunks blur into a singular, undulating mass. It was then that I first noticed the sound. It wasn't a branch snapping or a gust of wind. It was a rhythmic, subterranean thrum. Thump, thump, thump. It was a heartbeat, deep and slow, vibrating through the floorboards of the train. At first, I thought it was the engine, but the engine was steady. This was different. It was the forest breathing. It felt as though the entire woods were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. About an hour into the journey, the rhythm changed. The thrumming grew louder, and a new sound joined it, a knock. It came from the glass pane of my berth door. "Who is there?" I whispered, my voice feeling small against the vastness of the night. There was no immediate answer, just that steady, organic pulse. Then a second knock. This one was sharper. It wasn't a hand hitting glass. It sounded like a knuckle made of dents wood striking a surface. I pressed my face against the pane. Outside, the trees were dense, a wall of dark needles and bark. There was no room for a person to stand, yet there was a knock. Then, the knock began to morph. It didn't just sound like a strike anymore. It began to vibrate with a tonal quality, a low, resonant hum that started to shape itself into a syllable. It was a voice, but not a human one. It sounded like 1,000 dry reeds rubbing together in a gale. "Hush," the voice murmured. It wasn't a physical mouth moving, but the sound seemed to radiate from the very bark of the nearest tree. I felt a prickle of heat on my neck. The forest was no longer just observing, it was acknowledging me. I sat perfectly still, my breath hitching in my throat. The train slowed, the wheels groaning as they gripped the rails. The thrumming of the forest reached a crescendo, a deep, resonant moan that shook the lantern on my table. Then, the voice returned, clearer this time, vibrating from the trunks of 3 trees simultaneously. "Come," it sighed. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to open the door. It was a magnetic pull, a gravitational tug toward the darkness outside. I reached for the latch, my fingers trembling. I expected to see a deer, or perhaps a wandering traveler. But as the door swung open, the air that rushed in wasn't cold, it was humid and smelled of crushed moss and ancient sap. And then I saw it. It wasn't a ghost or a beast. It was a protrusion of the forest itself. A massive, shelf-like limb of bark, wide as a dining table, reached out from the nearest pine. It didn't have a face in the way we understand faces, but it had a series of concentric rings that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent amber light. From the center of these rings, a cluster of velvet-textured protrusions emerged, resembling the petals of a heavy flower but thick and fleshy. It wasn't a creature walking toward me, it was a part of the tree that had decided to reach out. It moved with a slow, grinding motion, like a heavy door opening on rusted hinges. "Stay," the voice whispered, now coming from the center of the amber rings. I reached out, my palm hovering just inches from the velvet texture. As I touched it, the forest went completely silent. The thrumming stopped. The heartbeat of the woods ceased. For a moment, I was the only thing moving in the universe. Then, the velvet surface rippled. It didn't just react to my touch. It began to fold inward, enveloping my hand like a warm, damp glove. The sensation was terrifyingly intimate. It wasn't just a tree touching a human. It was the forest claiming a piece of me. I felt the moisture of its skin seep into my pores, and for a split second, I could feel what it felt. I felt the deep, aching thirst of the roots and the slow, deliberate reach for the sun. The train gave a sudden jolt, and the limb retracted with a wet, suctioning sound. I pulled my hand back, gasping. The door swung shut of its own accord, and the rhythmic thrumming resumed, but it was faster now, more frantic. I looked out the window and saw that the tree was no longer just a tree. It had developed a slight, permanent curve toward my berth, as if it were leaning in to listen to my heartbeat. I didn't sleep for the rest of the journey. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that velvet texture against my skin. I realized then that the forest wasn't just a place I was traveling through. It was a single, colossal consciousness, and I was merely a tiny, fleeting thought in its vast, dreaming mind. The train finally pulled into the station, and I stepped out onto the platform, my legs feeling heavy and slightly damp. I looked back at the woods, which stood tall and silent under the moonlight. I felt safe, for the first time in hours, believing I had survived the encounter. But as I turned to walk toward the station house, I felt a small, sharp prick at the back of my neck, right where the velvet had touched me. I realized with a jolt of terror that the sensation wasn't coming from the outside anymore. The pulse was now coming from inside my own skin, and I could feel a tiny, wooden root beginning to coil around my spine. The mimic in the mud. I am writing this because I can no longer bear the psychological weight of the secret. It started 3 months ago when the construction crew finished the foundation of the north lot. It was a vast, flat expanse of wet concrete, still smelling of rain and minerals, bordered by the skeletal wooden frames of houses yet to be born. I was the first one to walk it every evening after the workers left. At first, I thought it was just the wind. I would step onto the gray surface, my boots making a rhythmic, squelching sound, and then I would hear it, a second squelch, just a fraction of a second after my own. It was subtle, a phantom echo that seemed to follow my lead. I chalked it up to the acoustics of the hollow lot, but as the weeks bled into one another, the echo began to develop a personality. It wasn't just a repeat, it was an imitation. One Tuesday, I paused for a heartbeat. The echo didn't just stop, it lingered for a millisecond longer than I did, as if it were exhaling a final breath of sound. That was the night I realized I wasn't walking alone. I began to experiment. I would take a wide stride, and the echo would mirror the distance. I would pivot on my heel, and the echo would rotate with the same flair. It felt like a rehearsal. I felt as though a silent observer was watching my every movement, memorizing the way my weight shifted from heel to toe, studying the arc of my arms. I started to feel a strange pressure in my chest, a sense of being judged by a perfectionist. I would try to surprise it by leaping, but the echo would always land with me, perfectly synchronized. It was as if the entity were a student of my physicality, practicing my gait until it could master the very essence of my motion. One evening, the fog rolled in, thick and smelling of damp earth. I stood at the far end of the foundation and called out, "Are you trying to become me?" There was no vocal response, but the echo reacted instantly. It didn't just mimic my step, it mimicked the slight, rhythmic sway of my shoulders as I spoke. It was becoming my twin in motion, if not in form. The real terror, however, struck during the final week of the foundation's curing. I decided to test its patience. I stood perfectly still, eyes closed, counting to 10. During the first 5 seconds, I felt nothing. But at the 6th second, I felt a subtle displacement in the air. It was a hum, a vibration of movement. It was moving while I was watching, but the moment I opened my eyes, it froze. It was a creature of the in-between. It lived in the gaps of my perception. It moved when my consciousness was diverted, then snapped back to its starting position the moment I turned my gaze toward it. I began to dread the moments of blinking. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined it gliding across the concrete, perfecting the curve of my spine, adjusting the tilt of my chin. It was a creature of velvet texture, covered in thousands of tiny, iridescent scales that shimmered like oil on water. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had a series of pulsing, golden ridges that rippled like a harp's strings when it moved. It was tall, slightly thinner than I was, with a body that looked like a piece of driftwood polished by the sea. It didn't have a nose or ears, just a singular, glowing orb of amber light where a forehead should be. It lived in the shadows of the foundation, hiding in the corners where the concrete met the dirt. I realized that it wasn't just copying me, it was studying me to eventually replace me. It wanted my walk, my posture, and my presence. One night, the moon was a sliver of white bone in the sky. I walked to the center of the lot and stopped. I felt the familiar weight of its presence. I closed my eyes for a long, deliberate count of 5. In that silence, I heard the sound of something heavy sliding over the smooth surface. It wasn't just a step, it was a fluid, sweeping glide. When I opened my eyes, the entity was standing 3 feet in front of me. It was perfectly still, its amber orb glowing with a soft, steady heat. It had captured my exact posture, the slight lean of my torso, the way my left hand curled inward. It was no longer just rehearsing. It had finished the practice. It was ready to take the lead. I took 1 step forward, expecting it to follow. Instead, it stepped into my space, its body overlapping mine for a fleeting second. It moved with the grace of a dancer, but its movement was so perfect it felt eerie, like a movie frame repeating itself. I reached out to touch its side, but as my fingers brushed the scales, it vanished into the corner of the lot. It didn't just move away, it retracted, as if being pulled into a pocket of space. I stood there in the silence of the housing tract, my heart hammering against my ribs. I realized then that it wasn't just mimicking my walk to be graceful. It was mimicking my walk to learn how to be human. I turned to walk home, but as I did, I noticed the ground behind me. There were no footprints of my own, only the deep, deliberate impressions of the entity, which had decided to stay behind and perfect my departure. I realized that when I am gone, it will be the one to walk these grounds, wearing my movements like a well-tailored suit. I am no longer the primary traveler of this lot. I am merely the rough draft of its final masterpiece. It is waiting for the day I stop walking so it can finally take my place entirely. Every night now, when I lie in bed, I can hear the faint, rhythmic squelch of its rehearsal in the silence of the house, and I know it is still perfecting the way I breathe. The shed's inheritance. The backyard was a kingdom of heavy, suffocating silence. The air hung still, thick with the scent of damp grass and the musk of earth that hadn't seen a footfall in days. In the center of this overgrown expanse sat the shed, a sturdy timber structure with a slanted roof that seemed to lean into the shadows like a weary traveler. I stood in the doorway, my knuckles white as I gripped a heavy iron lantern. The flame inside flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched toward the tall grass. I took a breath, the air tasting of pine and dust, and stepped inside. It was a strange transition. The outside world fell away, replaced by the intimate, enclosed atmosphere of the shed. It had been transformed into a perfect spare bedroom. A simple cot sat against the far wall, its woolen blanket folded with military precision. Beside it stood a small, heavy oak desk, and a single window faced the gnarled branches of a massive oak tree. The floorboards were smooth, yet they carried the faint, lingering scent of linseed oil and old paper. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Then I noticed it. On my left forearm, a mark had appeared. It was a thin, jagged line, about 3 inches long, cutting through the skin. It looked like a silver scar left by a bramble bush, yet I felt a jolt of confusion. I remembered my morning clearly. I hadn't brushed against a single thorn, hadn't scraped my skin on a single branch. It was a new addition to my body, a gift from the room itself. As I watched, the scar began to pulse. It wasn't just a static mark on the surface. It felt like a seam in my very skin, slightly raised and radiating a faint, rhythmic warmth. It throbbed like a tiny heart beating beneath my flesh. Then, a sound broke the silence. From the far corner, something heavy slid across the floorboards. It wasn't the sharp scuttle of an insect or the frantic dash of a mouse. It was a deep, resonant vibration of weight, a dragging sound that made the dust motes dance in the lantern light. It wasn't a creature yet. It was the presence of something substantial moving through the shadows. I held my breath, and the scar on my arm reacted. It began to lengthen, moving toward my elbow. It didn't just grow, it unzipped. My skin rippled like the surface of a pond in slow motion, the jagged line widening into a gateway. Then, it emerged from the corner. It was a tall, lanky thing, elegant and alien. Its body was covered in a coat of iridescent, overlapping scales that shimmered between copper and moss green, catching the lantern light with every micro-movement. Its face was a peculiar, flat disc, devoid of a traditional nose or mouth, featuring only 3 horizontal slits. It lacked the complexity of many limbs, but its joints moved with a fluid, clicking rhythm, like the ticking of a sophisticated clockwork mechanism. The creature moved forward with a graceful, swaying gait. As it passed the oak desk, it shuddered. A thin, translucent membrane began to peel away from its back, peeling off like the skin of a ripening fruit. With a dry, papery rustle, the membrane fell to the floor. It was a hollow, rigid shell of the creature, perfectly preserved in shape, but completely empty inside. It looked like a dried husk of a seed, a ghost of the movement that had just occurred. I felt a prickle of dread crawl up my spine. I backed away toward the cot, my boots creaking on the wood. As I retreated, the scar on my arm reached my shoulder. It was no longer a simple line. It was widening into a deep, jagged crack, as if my arm were being split by an invisible wedge. The creature moved again, its scales clicking as it passed the cot. Another shell fell from its back, clattering against the wood with a hollow ring. This one was slightly more brittle than the first, sounding like porcelain hitting stone. A realization washed over me, cold and sudden. The creature wasn't just moving through the room, it was shedding its previous self as it inhabited the space. Each object it touched, each corner it occupied, left a ghost of its previous form behind. It was a traveler leaving a trail of its own history in its wake. The creature was now only 3 feet from me. Its 3 slits began to vibrate rapidly, producing a low, humming note. It was a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate in my marrow, making my teeth ache with a strange, symphonic pressure. The scar on my arm reached my collarbone. It began to pull my skin inward, creating a slight depression. It felt as though something was trying to push out from underneath my ribs, a hidden passenger seeking an exit. The creature reached out. One of its limbs, ending in a wide, flat paddle instead of a hand, extended toward me. It touched my chest with a gentle, deliberate pressure. Then a sudden, violent jerk happened. The scar on my arm burst open completely. It wasn't a wound of pain, but a wound of transition. I felt a sudden, immense pressure in my chest. I hadn't received a wound, but the wound was now claiming my body. It felt as if my internal organs were being reorganized, shifted by an invisible hand. The creature stood perfectly still. It looked at me with its 3 slits, its scales gleaming in the fading lantern light. It seemed to be waiting, a patient observer of the exchange, as if it were watching a seed sprout in fast forward. I felt my own ribs begin to crack outward, expanding to accommodate the new geometry of my frame. I was becoming the new shell, the vessel for the inhabitant. The creature began to fold itself into the space where my ribcage used to be, sliding into my torso with a series of wet, clicking sounds. I am standing in the center of the shed. I am the hollow husk now, and the creature is my interior. The scar on my arm is the only thing left of my original skin, and it is starting to itch from the inside out. The Synchrony of Silence. October 12th. I arrived at the Blackwood power plant today. It is a skeletal cathedral of rusted iron and cooling concrete, mostly hollow now that the turbines have stopped spinning. My job is simple: ensure the moisture doesn't rot the main gears and keep the records updated. It is a lonely post, but I prefer the company of machinery over people. The air here tastes of ozone and old dust. I have set up my cot in the central hub, right beneath the towering cooling tower. It is incredibly quiet, save for the distant drip of condensation. October 14th. The silence here isn't empty, it feels heavy. I spent the afternoon walking the catwalks. The metal groans under my boots, a rhythmic protest that echoes for miles. I noticed something peculiar about the local wildlife. There are pigeons that nest in the rafters and small, hardy rodents that scurry through the pipes. They are noisy creatures, usually chirping or squeaking in a chaotic mess of sound. Yet, every time I stop to breathe, they seem to pause. It is as if they are waiting for a command. October 17th. I saw it for the first time today. I was in the sub-basement, checking the pressure gauges, when the light flickered. From the far end of the corridor, a figure emerged. It isn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It is a towering, lanky thing with a body of textured bronze skin. Its left side moves with a slow, fluid grace, as if it were submerged in deep water, swaying like a kelp forest. Conversely, its right side is erratic and frantic. It jerks and twitches with such velocity that it seems to struggle to keep up with the left. It has a face of smooth porcelain, but instead of eyes, it has 2 deep, swirling pits that glow with a soft amber luminescence. It didn't walk toward me. It drifted, its left arm trailing behind it in a graceful curve while its right arm snapped forward in jagged, staccato bursts. October 19th. The entity is becoming more frequent. I've started naming it the asymmetry. It doesn't make a sound, but it leaves a trail of frost on the floor wherever its right side strikes the ground. I found myself watching it for an hour today. It stood in the middle of the turbine hall. I could see its left shoulder rising and falling in a languid, oceanic motion, while its right shoulder shuddered with a rapid-fire vibration. It seemed to be trying to synchronize the 2 halves of its body, a perpetual struggle between flow and fracture. October 21st. The animals are reacting more intensely now. Today, I was sitting in the central hub, eating a piece of bread. A dozen pigeons were fluttering about my head, their wings beating a frantic rhythm. Then, the asymmetry appeared in the doorway. The moment it stepped into the room, every single bird froze. Not a single feather twitched. The silence was absolute, a vacuum of sound that felt like it pressed against my eardrums. They weren't just quiet, they were terrified. They waited until it passed me before the explosion of wing beats resumed. October 23rd. I heard it coming before I saw it. A wet, dragging sound from the left and a sharp, clicking sound from the right. It is moving faster now. It spends most of its time in the upper rafters, but it likes to descend when the moon is high. I find myself holding my breath constantly. If I breathe too loudly, the asymmetry seems to turn its porcelain face toward me. It doesn't have a mouth to speak, but I feel it communicating. It wants to find the source of the noise. October 25th. I woke up in the middle of the night to a haunting sensation. The plant was humming. Not the mechanical hum of the machines, but a low, thrumming vibration that came from the floor. I sat up and saw it standing at the foot of my cot. It was tall, nearly 8 feet. Its left side was draped in a slow, rolling wave of motion, while its right side was a blur of rapid, jagged movements. It was moving toward me in a strange, lopsided gait. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just watched that bronze skin shimmer in the moonlight. October 27th. The silence is becoming my constant companion. It's no longer just a reaction to the asymmetry. It's a state of being. The birds are always still when it is near. The rodents stop their scurrying. Even the wind seems to hold its breath when the bronze figure passes through a room. It is as if the entity drinks the sound of the world, leaving only its own internal rhythm behind. October 29th. Today was the day of the great hush. I was in the main hall and the asymmetry was at the far end. It was moving toward me, its left side drifting like a leaf on a pond, its right side snapping like a whip. I was whistling a low tune. Suddenly, the asymmetry stopped. Its right side jerked once, sharply. Every bird in the rafters ceased its chirping. Every mouse in the walls froze. The silence was so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat. It was the sound of the world holding its breath, waiting for the asymmetry to claim the next note. October 30th. It finally reached me. It stood directly in front of my face, its porcelain features inches from my own. The left side was moving so slowly it was almost imperceptible, a gentle, underwater swell. The right side was vibrating so fast it created a faint, high-pitched hum. I felt a coldness radiate from its bronze skin. It didn't move toward me, and I didn't move away. We stood in the center of the dead plant, surrounded by 1,000 silent animals. Then it did something unexpected. It reached out with its slow left hand and touched my chest, while its fast right hand gripped my shoulder. The moment it touched me, the silence broke. Every bird screamed, every mouse squeaked, and the plant erupted in a cacophony of sound. But as the noise faded, the asymmetry didn't retreat. It remained there, its left side now perfectly still, while its right side began to twitch with a new, frantic speed, as if it were trying to shake off the memory of my touch. October 31st. I am still here, but the silence has changed. The birds are no longer just quiet when it is near. They are quiet because they are afraid to move at all. I realize today that the asymmetry isn't just moving through the plant. It is stealing the movement of everything else. I looked at my own hand as I wrote this and noticed that my left fingers were beginning to move with a fluid, underwater grace, while my right fingers began to jerk with a frantic, impossible speed. I am becoming the next part of its rhythm, and the silence is waiting for my final movement. The guest who didn't fit the frame. If you are reading this, the power has likely returned to the house by now, and the humming of the refrigerator has silenced the silence. When we arrived on Tuesday, the outage was total. It felt as though the house had been exhaled by the world, leaving us suspended in a thick, velvet vacuum of shadows. We didn't light the candles immediately. We wanted to see what the darkness held. It was on the first night, while the air grew heavy and stagnant, that I first noticed the handprints. They appeared on the large bay window in the living room, small, wet smudges of moisture that hadn't come from the rain. They were perfectly shaped, but not quite human. They were slightly too wide, with 4 distinct peaks instead of 5. "Did you see that?" my daughter whispered, her breath hitching in the gloom. I looked, but the glass was clear. By the time I blinked, a second set of prints had appeared, higher up, as if something had reached out to touch the ceiling. It wasn't a ghost, at least not a traditional one. It felt more like a presence, a lingering thought made manifest. By the second day, the prints became more frequent. They were no longer just on the glass, they were appearing on the walls, and, sometimes, on the back of my own neck as I sat perfectly still. I began to realize that the entity was moving in the middle distance. It wasn't a solid shape that sat in the corner. Instead, it was a pocket of not quite there. When I looked directly at it, it seemed to vanish, retreating into the periphery of my vision. It was a hole in the air, a shimmering distortion like heat haze rising off a summer road, but with a texture like crumpled silk. It had a pulse. It didn't have a face, but it had a rim, a jagged, vibrating edge that seemed to chew at the edges of the furniture. "Is it watching us?" my daughter asked, pointing at the empty space between the sofa and the bookshelf. I could see the way the dust motes swirled around the distortion, orbiting a center that was almost invisible. It was a hungry gap in reality. As the third day dawned, the house began to feel smaller. The damp handprints were everywhere now, appearing in clusters. They weren't just on the glass anymore. They were appearing on the floorboards, and then on the very fabric of the curtains. The water from the prints didn't evaporate. It stayed, glistening like beads of sweat. I found myself walking through the rooms with a strange, rhythmic caution. I realized that the more I tried to pin the entity down with my eyes, the faster it fled. It was a shy thing, a shy void. It lived in the space between here and there. However, by the fourth night, the distance began to shrink. The hole in the middle distance was no longer content to stay at the edges of my awareness. It was drifting closer. The distortion was growing larger, its edges becoming sharper and more defined. It started to pull the light of the moon into its center, warping the shadows of the chairs into elongated, weeping shapes. I sat in the center of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The damp prints began to appear on the walls in real time, forming in rapid succession. Thump, thump, squelch. Something was pressing against the boundaries of the room. I could hear the sound of wet skin hitting wood, even though I couldn't see the source. The distortion was now just 3 feet away, hovering at chest height. It was no longer a simple hole. It had started to develop a texture of deep, rhythmic ripples, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a submerged stone. I reached out a hand, my fingers trembling. I expected to feel something solid, but as my hand entered the distortion, my skin felt a sudden, delicious chill. It wasn't cold like ice, it was cold like a secret. I could feel the texture of the void smooth, slightly tacky, and vibrating with a low frequency that hummed in my teeth. Suddenly, the house went perfectly still. The damp prints stopped appearing. The distortion stopped drifting. It sat there, a shimmering, undulating gap in the air, perfectly balanced in the center of the room. I took a deep breath and finally forced my gaze to lock onto its center, refusing to let my eyes wander. The hole shuddered. It didn't have a mouth, but it seemed to exhale a faint mist of moisture. Then it did something unexpected. It began to expand, not outward, but inward, as if it were drinking the room. The edges of the distortion started to pull the walls toward it, stretching the wood and the plaster. The damp prints on the walls began to slide, racing toward the center like rain running down a tilted roof. I felt the pull in my own chest, my hair being drawn toward the void. It was a vacuum of existence, a beautiful, terrifying hunger. I watched as the chair next to me was slowly warped, its legs lengthening and curving toward the hole. It was beautiful, in a way, a perfect circle of almost. But as the distortion grew, it began to leave a trail of water on the floor, a puddle that expanded with every pulse of its ripple. It was finally claiming the space. I realized then that it wasn't just a hole in the middle distance, it was a hole in the world, and it was finally ready to be filled. I reached out and touched the very center of the ripple, and for a moment, my fingers disappeared into the distortion. I didn't feel pain. I felt a sense of homecoming. Then, the expansion stopped. The distortion held its shape, perfectly still, a shimmering crown of texture in the middle of the room. The house was silent again. The power was still out, the air was still heavy, and the damp prints were all concentrated in a single, massive circle on the floor. I stood up, my limbs feeling slightly heavy, as if I were still partially submerged in water. I looked at the wall where the first print had appeared on the first night. It was gone. The entity had finished its meal. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden, the moonlight casting long, pale shadows across the grass. The room felt empty yet full. I sat in my chair, watching the spot where the hole had been. It was no longer there, but the air still tasted of wet silk. I realized that the entity hadn't just visited the house, it had carved a permanent seat for itself in our reality. I closed my eyes and could still feel the ripple of it against my skin. I reached out to touch the empty air, and my fingers met something slightly damp and cold. It wasn't the hole anymore, but it was still there, waiting just behind my eyelids. If you are reading this, the power has likely returned to the house by now, and the humming of the refrigerator has silenced the silence. The Ledger of the Rusted Tower. The water tower stands alone in the center of the prairie, a hulking, rusted iron cylinder that groans whenever the wind moves through the tall grass. It is a monument to a town that died out a century ago, yet for my family, it is the place where the silence speaks the loudest. My father and I spent our summers there, climbing the metal ribs of the structure to sit in the belly of the tank and watch the horizon stretch into infinity. It was during the third summer of my life that I first noticed the twins. They weren't born twins. They appeared in the tower, emerging from the shadows of the iron rafters. They were identical in almost every way, except for one peculiar detail. One of them had hair that felt like crushed velvet, while the other had hair that felt like wet silk. One had a thumb that was slightly longer than the other, and one had a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on their left wrist. They were inseparable, moving in a synchronized dance that was almost, but not quite, perfect. My father, a man of steady nerves and deep patience, loved them both. He would sit on the floor of the tank, his back against the curved metal, and watch them play with smooth river stones. One afternoon, while the sun was dipping low, casting long, orange shadows across the prairie, I asked him a question that had been simmering in my mind for days. "Father, which of the twins is the real one?" He didn't look up immediately. He just kept his eyes on the two small figures weaving between his knees. He sighed, a sound of heavy contemplation. "The real one is the one who breathes when you aren't looking," he replied. That night, I found the first entry in the Lost and Found ledger. It was a heavy, leather-bound book my father had carried up the tower, its pages smelling of old rain and iron. On the first page, in his neat script, he had written, "A small wooden whistle. Found by the real twin. Returned by the twin." I remember the whistle. It was a simple thing, carved from oak. But as I touched it, I noticed something strange. The whistle felt warm, as if it had just been held in a palm, yet it had been sitting on the table for hours. The next day, I found the whistle again in the center of the tower. It was perfectly dry, but it smelled of salt. I picked it up and handed it to my father. He took it, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the whistle, then at the twins, who were sitting perfectly still in the corner. The silk-haired twin reached out and grabbed it. The velvet-haired twin remained motionless. The silk-haired one took it, I whispered. My father nodded. "No," he corrected. "The twin took it. The real one is still holding the memory of it." The following week, the ledger grew. A brass button, a smoothed piece of flint, a dried wildflower. Each time, the items appeared in the tower, and each time, the ledger recorded their journey. But the entries started to become confusing. A brass button, found by the real twin, returned by the twin. A piece of flint, found by the real twin, returned by the twin. The twins were becoming more distinct, or perhaps I was becoming more observant. The silk-haired twin began to move with a fluid, liquid grace, while the velvet-haired twin moved with a slight, jerky hesitation, as if it were learning to walk in real time. One evening, as a storm brewed over the prairie, the twins were playing near the rusted railing. The silk-haired one was spinning a marble, while the velvet-haired one sat perfectly still, watching the marble move. I watched them for a long time, noticing how the velvet-haired twin's eyes didn't seem to blink in sync with the other. When the wind died down, I looked at the ledger. My father had written a new entry, a marble. Found by the twin. Returned by the real one. I looked at the twins. The silk-haired one was still spinning the marble. The velvet-haired one was holding its hands out, open and empty. I realized then that the velvet-haired twin was the one who had found the marble in its mind, but the silk-haired twin was the one who physically possessed it. My father sat beside me, his face illuminated by the dim lantern light. "Which one is the real one now?" I asked. He pointed to the velvet-haired twin. "The one who knows it is pretending." The twins stopped their play. They both turned to look at us. The silk-haired twin smiled, a wide, perfect curve of the lips. The velvet-haired twin's smile was slightly wider, reaching just a fraction of an inch further toward its ears. The silk-haired twin's eyes were the color of moss. The velvet-haired twin's eyes were the color of deep, stagnant pond water. They were almost the same, but the velvet-haired twin's pupils were slightly irregular, like a cracked piece of glass. I reached out to touch the velvet-haired twin's hair. It felt like wet silk. I reached out to touch the silk-haired twin's hair. It felt like crushed velvet. They had switched their primary textures. My father chuckled, a low, vibrating sound. "They are trading places," he said. "The real one is tired of being the same." I looked at the ledger again. The last entry was written in a hand that was slightly shakier than my father's usual script. "The velvet-haired twin is the real one," it read. "The silk-haired twin is the memory of what it used to be." I looked at the velvet-haired twin. It was staring at me, its mouth slightly open. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It simply existed, a perfect, slightly off-center copy of a child. Then, the silk-haired twin leaned in and whispered into my ear, its voice a dry rasp. "I am the one who remembers," it said. The velvet-haired twin then stood up and took the father's hand. It was the first time it had moved without a jerk. It moved with a fluid, liquid grace. My father looked at the velvet-haired twin, then at the silk-haired twin, and finally at me. He closed the ledger with a soft thud. "The real one is the one who wants to be you," he said softly. I looked at the twins one last time before they fell asleep in the hollow of the tank. The velvet-haired twin was holding the wooden whistle, its grip firm and steady. The silk-haired twin was holding the marble, but it wasn't spinning it anymore. It was just holding it, as if it were a prize it had forgotten how to use. I realized then that the twins weren't just two versions of the same person. They were a sequence. One was the past, one was the present, and one was the future. My father stood up to leave, his shadow stretching long against the rusted iron. He took the ledger and tucked it under his arm. "Go to sleep," he told me. "Tomorrow, the real one will find something new." I closed my eyes, but as I drifted off, I felt a small, cold weight on my chest. I opened my eyes to see the velvet-haired twin sitting on my stomach, its eyes wide and unblinking. It wasn't breathing, but it was perfectly still. It reached out a hand and touched my cheek. Its skin wasn't warm like a human's, it was the temperature of a stone left in the shade. I realized then that the velvet-haired twin wasn't just a twin at all. It was the one that had stayed behind when the real one moved on. I looked at the silk-haired twin, who was now curled into a ball in the corner, its hair shimmering like wet silk in the moonlight. It was the ghost of a feeling, a lingering echo of a child who had once been whole. My father walked out into the prairie, his footsteps muffled by the tall grass. I stayed in the tank, caught between the memory of the silk and the reality of the velvet. The silence of the tower wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I reached out to touch the velvet-haired twin's hair one last time. It felt like wet silk. The twins' eyes shifted, and for a split second, I saw a flash of something deep inside them, not a reflection, but a tiny, shimmering spark of a person who is still trying to figure out how to be real. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.